Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Loubna El Amine. I'm a lecturer at King's College London.
wonderful. Thank you for being with us. And apart from anything else, I love the artworks on the walls behind you. Do you mind
Thank
just
you.
telling me a little bit about them? I mean, folks listening won't see them, but I can sort of see two and a half of them, I think.
Yeah, I think I got this one from Hong Kong.
Uh-huh.
Um, and the other one is a friend who's Lebanese, and he does this nice kind of
Right.
drawing. He's a kind of actually works on Arabic calligraphy, so I guess the image is inspired from that kind of aesthetic.
And
Um,
above your left
this
shoulder,
is
I
a
can
poster.
see something that
This
looks
is
like
like
Sidney
a
Buffett.
it's a Tate Gallery poster. It's a Jean du Buffet.
Jean Dubuffet, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Not quite sexy
How
buff.
could you not know?
No,
It's not that I have it in front of me. That's not why I knew it.
now, Prof, I'm wanting to ask you what I ask of all my guests, which is to
Mhm.
inquire as to what's currently dynamizing, impeding, interesting, preoccupying you.
What's going on in Lebanon? That's an easy one for me. Yeah. I mean, easy in a sad way. It's sad that that's been what's been preoccupying me for the past few months, to be honest.
And you've written very movingly about growing up in Lebanon,
Mhm.
studying in Lebanon, and the family there. Could you tell us a bit more about the things that are preoccupying you right now, even though, of course, they're part of the daily news? But the daily news that we get here in Mexico tends to be inflected with US preoccupations, despite the fact, of course, that there are many people who are Lebanese descended right across Latin
Yeah.
America.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Um, I mean, I'm just trying to think about how to frame this. I mean, obviously there's the aspect of the Israeli war on Gaza and then on Lebanon. So that's always a source of preoccupation, and it's been for the past few months. The added element in Lebanon is the divisions within Lebanon about how to deal with it. So when you combine those two together, the presence of an aggressor on the borders and then the divisions within Lebanese society, you have this sense as someone from there and who loves that country that it's not clear how you would solve it. It just seems so intractable that it's just very hard. It just makes you sad when you think about it, that it's unclear how and who could solve it and how. And that sense of hopelessness is sort of, it's heavy.
And really, throughout your life, be it the Civil War, so-called,
Mhm.
be it the Israeli invasions, there has been doom and destruction alongside, no doubt, life and gaiety and family love. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, for sure. For sure. Even now, I mean, even when I talk to my parents now and they're amidst of everything, we always manage to laugh about something, even sometimes laugh about the situation. I mean, they were I don't know how much you get into details, but they were telling me that someone had moved into the apartment next to them, and there's this been concern in Lebanon about when people move in because the different communities are worried about each other because they don't know who the person is, and maybe that person is going to be targeted. And long story short, the my father asked this person who just moved in the apartment next to them because his apartment has been empty, and the person has the most controversial name that you could ever think about. And then he was telling me the story and telling me how they both laughed when the person told him his name because it was like, this is the most stressful name you can have because it's the name of someone who, he's passed away now, but it's someone who the Israelis had been after for a long time. So this person has this name who moved next to my parents. And then the point is that the way he told me the story, it was on the one hand scary, but he was saying we were laughing about it because he
Well, I
was
know
also laughing at the neighbor talking about it. And it was just funny because it was so absurd and so
this is such a Mexican or Colombian story. It really is. I mean, the way in which humor always lives alongside the reality of, horrible violence. It's a different kind of violence. It's not
Yeah.
war in the sense that your family is experiencing. Before we get on to talking about your scholarly work, I wanted to ask you about the wonderful creative nonfiction, let's call it, that you've
Yeah.
written, much of which I've read, and one of which is that they're very moving things about your parents' different villages.
Yes.
You just mentioned your mom and dad.
Yeah.
Would it be okay to ask you about those pieces, comparing the villages from whence they came?
Yeah. I mean, I mostly knew my mother's village growing up because my father's village was too close to the Israeli occupation for us to go, so we didn't go very much. But it's interesting. I mean, part of the reason why I wanted to write that story was to kind of give a sense of the diversity of the South, because when you talk about it, and for outsiders, the idea of the South, and then, this idea that it's all the same and there's Hezbollah everywhere, and in fact, my mother's village was very different from my father's village. Part of it is because it was far from the occupation, and so it didn't have to sort of adjust to that kind of life. So it was much more, I mean, at least my experience of it, one, because I could actually go there, but two, it was a bit more of a gay, happy place kind of thing. Whereas my father's village, because again, it's not close to the occupation, it had long been a place where people were fighting the occupation from, so it has this kind of more austere feel, and people are a bit more religious there. Um, but the idea was to sort of show how, the South is different places. And in fact, these two villages, people in them would criticize each other probably for their different traditions. They also belong to different political parties. My mom's village is closer to another Shia party that's not Hezbollah. Sadly, though, to link it back to what's going on, it's my mother's village is getting heavily bombed now, and it's actually the one village that, again, growing up was outside of that space of, the Israeli war, because it's where we fled. We fled there also during the war in Lebanon, when in the internal fighting, not even just because of Israeli aggression, but it's always seemed like a place that was far from the Israeli occupation and that kind of was able to live its life. And for some reason or another that I don't understand, it's been very, very heavily bombed actually recently. And so in some sense, the two villages are getting a more similar fate right now.
This is indeed a great tragedy. Speaking of another tragic moment, I wanted to ask you about one of your other, again, I'm calling it creative nonfiction, but you know what
Yeah.
could be called reportage. And forgive me for my poor pronunciation, but Nasrallah's funeral,
Yes.
could you correct my pronunciation first
No,
off?
Nasrallah, it's perfect. You said it perfect.
Nasrallah, okay.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that piece?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned this because I had no intention necessarily of writing about this because I was in London when the funeral was happening, so I was watching it
Right.
online. I honestly, the music was beautiful. I know this is not I don't know if this is this, what you're asking, but like I was very moved by that funeral because again, so technically in Shia culture and religion, you don't want like happy music, and it's meant to be kind of austere, and there's no, I mean, and normally the chanting is kind of like, it's more chanting than it's actually singing. Like that's not the kind of music normally it has to be kind of a call to war. This music, it turns out it's written for them, but it's this kind of like it's very kind of very like it's a lot of violin. It's very sad, but also very, it's almost like it was the whole funeral was a love letter to him, like a love, and the speeches were very loving, and the speeches talked about, um, him being missed. It didn't have any of the features of the kind of the more military aspects, you may say, of what, Hezbollah is normally associated with. I mean, and Nasrallah himself had these two faces. So sometimes he would give these speeches that were very call to action and kind of, um, harsh-toned and sort of critical of others and stuff. And sometimes he had these speeches where he was kind of mellow and made jokes and seemed kind of like sort of approachable in a way. And the funeral definitely sort of played on this. I mean, well, that's not true. It did have some of the first features too in terms of criticizing talk about US and Israel and all of that. But there was this love and this loss, and that music conveyed it so beautifully. And sort of when I was just watching it, I'm like, I was wanting to, I mean, for me, it just reminds you that there's this whole aspect of that movement and of that party that's kind of like, what this person kind of represented for people, this hope of a different fate for their country, for their villages, and all of that. Um, and this love for that man and the ability to bring that out in these aesthetically pleasing. So we think of these fighters as being ascetic or not caring about life. That's the story that you often get, that all just want to die and all of that. You don't make that music if you want to die. It's just it's a clearly like it was art, and it's beautiful. And I just sort of I was sort of compelled to write about it.
I think you mentioned the violin in the first sentence, actually.
I do, yeah. It was so beautiful.
Uh,
Yeah.
Moving on to your scholarly work, Prof. One of the things that interests me is probably know, hola, ¿qué tal? All people of Arabic descent in Latin America are called los turcos.
Ah, interesting. Okay, I didn't know that actually.
Yeah,
Yeah,
everybody,
yeah,
everybody.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
People who moved here during the Ottoman Empire, people who came here after 1948,
yeah.
who
They're
came
still
yesterday.
Turcos.
You're all
Yeah.
Turks, right? And that's a jumping off point for me into your bravura comparative political theory and thought work,
Hmm.
because a lot of your work is about Confucianism, but you also look at theories of politics and political thought uh, under, in inverted commas, the Ottomans. And I wondered if we could perhaps start there.
Yeah. I mean, I will say Um, when I look at the ancient Chinese world, there's not too much of a I mean, if there's a comparison, it's with the Greeks, not with because you don't have that the history from the Islamic world is less known for that. I mean, it wasn't there first, and then to get to the Ottomans, it's a later period. Um, but so. I guess one way to actually respond to your question is to say that I was interested in this new project that's more about the early modern period and bringing the Ottomans, because I did want to bring those two worlds together, because there's this way in which I'm from Lebanon, I'm interested in that, but what I work on is completely unrelated. And so actually working on the Ottomans was a way to kind of, you know, find a way for me to kind of put those things together that, we learned about the Ottomans at school as something that's like, the history of Lebanon, that's where we start, with the Ottomans. And so this was a way for me to find a way to bring those two worlds together, but it wouldn't necessarily apply to my work on ancient China.
It's an interesting thing. The sexy, expensive, glamorous Turkish soap operas about
Yeah,
the height of the Ottoman Empire are wildly popular here. And
interesting.
over the last 15 years, there are lots of newborns who have
Yeah.
Turkish names in amongst their Spanish names.
We had that in Lebanon, like where do you know that when someone speaks very formal Arabic in Lebanon, you say you're speaking in Mexican? That's like because they had these Mexican soap operas that were dubbed in this formal Arabic, and no one speaks this way. And so when you get these like, like people speaking like using this very formal, and they would say Mexique, Mexique, So it's the same
Great.
idea, right? That's
Oh,
like,
both
you know,
ways. Well, there are also all through Latin America, there are all these girls born between 1981 and 85, hola, ¿qué tal? Who are called, their name is spelled Leidy, which is pronounced as Lady D, which means
uh-huh.
Lady Di,
Huh.
for Diana Spencer, the former
I
wife of
see. Yeah,
Barack
yeah, yeah,
Obama.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So
There are
that's
all these girls called Lady D, now in their mid to late
yeah.
40s, and their children don't understand this because,
So, what kind of name is that?
Lady D. I love these fragments of cultural exchange. And that is
Yeah,
one of the things that's interesting, I guess, about the Ottoman Empire. There's a sense of tolerance for difference, I think it's fair to say, in
yeah,
certain
yeah,
things.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
Could you talk a bit about that, how that plays out for you in political terms, in theoretical terms too?
Well, my interest in the Ottomans. And empires, that article I have about the empires was really an interest in the form of political organization. So my thought there is that when we do political theory, we take the modern state for granted. And then we have these ways, and we're like, okay, how do we adjust for cultural plurality within the modern state? How do we make minorities fit in? And then you have all of this literature on multiculturalism. So trying to kind of make the modern state kind of be amenable to difference and to pluralism and all of that. And then there's different variations about how you do that. And my hunch there is it's not going to work because the state itself is based on exclusion. I mean by this is that the concept of sovereignty is related to territorial sovereignty, and borders means that there's some people in and some people out, and the ones who are in, there's gonna, it's impossible to kind of contain these kind of differences inside these kind of borders. So there's always going to be ways in which the people who are inside are going to want to be more outside, or the insiders come in, or the appeals from the inside to us. Anyhow, so then my interest was like, why are we constraining ourselves and kind of trying to solve these problems within the confines of the modern state? Why not say, why are we just assuming that this is the only way we could do this, right? Why not think, okay, let's think beyond the state? I mean, people think this is kind of crazy a little bit, but it shouldn't be, because if you look at, most of the history, it didn't work through, the state is a probably 17th century onwards. I mean, that's the earliest, and can be in lots of parts of the world, it's really a 20th century invention. So the thought there was that the Ottomans and the Qing Empire and the Mughals, and you can think of lots of examples in history, did not organize politics around notions of territory, around notions of borders, in this way in which you cross this territory or this border and you completely don't belong. Like this line is so determines so much of your life. And so I was interested in how they did that, and how these imperial structures sort of were much more fluid in that way, and how then were they able to accommodate differences in the way that the modern state does not. And so the Ottomans, especially in the earlier periods, not the later ones, so sort of more 17th, 18th century, and less so sort of then as it gets into the 19th century, the Ottomans become a bit more they start to emulate the form of the nation state and become a bit more um, uh, sort of less tolerant, become less tolerant. But so they sort of allowed for these kind of ways in which people could live their lives in non-uniform ways. You didn't have to have a uniform law. You didn't even have you to have uniform economic systems. Um, and then you have the uniform, you could have different plural ways of sort of forms of rule. And yeah, and I think that comes from the idea that they did not feel the need to sort of speak to all of their citizens in the same exact language in the way that a modern state does. And so I was interested in the possibilities inherent in these other forms of political organizations to be flexible in these ways that we don't expect anymore from modern states.
Now, your big area is Confucian slash
Right.
Chinese political social theory and so on. As I said to you before we started recording, Prof, I'm here in the global south. As you know, we just don't get access to most scholarly
Mhm.
books in English. But
Yeah.
I've read some of your wonderful essays on these topics. And I started off with the one that pummels poor old Bertrand Russell. You take the big
You feel
man,
bad for him?
you
Yeah.
take the big man down.
I mean, he's used to it in his grave. It's fine.
Exactly. Would you tell us a little bit, hola, buenos, about Russell and China and how that's a good jumping off point for you? Because it is a great essay that you wrote.
Oh, thank you. Well, it just allowed me to sort of discuss these kind of stereotypes of China as this kind of, yeah, the East in generally, the way in which, if anything positive has been said about it, is that it's like this spiritual sanctuary of some kind. And sometimes when I tell people that I work on Confucianism, they will just assume that it's something like Buddhism or Taoism, but I'm interested in spirituality. And I have to sort of, very fast sort of like disabuse them of this idea and say, in fact, what I like about it is precisely not that. It's precisely that it's not spiritual, because there's nothing spiritual. I mean, I shouldn't say this, but it's not a philosophy that's transcendent is very much a
But
philosophy, the Confucian philosophy of this world and this society. Sorry, go ahead.
when you go for job interviews, you have to watch out in case they think you're a granola lady, right?
Yeah,
That's the
exactly.
problem. Mm.
So I have to kind of make sure that I was like, look, don't think that that's what you're getting. Um, yeah, and in that actually relates to also the point about politics, and that's relates to the Russell article in the sense that also often also the association with the East is that spirituality, but then maybe ethics, and then the politics. No one thinks that that's what you get from the East, because again, it's what's giving you some kind of self-development or and that's how they put these like the Chinese books in the, I don't know if they still exist, the Barnes and Nobles, in the like the spirituality kind of, aisles. Whereas I'm interested in thinking like, why can't we have thinking about sort of Confucian thought next to like Greek thought or something, it doesn't even have to be the Stoics. It's just like, Aristotle gave us a view of government. We can think of Confucius giving us that. And so Russell was really just a segue into kind of thinking about um, that what we can learn from China and the East does not have to lie in these kind of ideas that I think are, I mean, they're not wrong, but they're too simplistic about sort of the spirituality inherent in these kind of non-Western worlds.
I guess he was doing what a lot of the great thinkers of modernity in the so-called West were doing, whether it's Mauss or Levi-Strauss or Freud, uh, Durkheim, all these guys. They're trying to understand, oh, ¿qué tal, hombre? What it is that makes societies stay together.
Yeah,
They think that this has been lost in the
yeah,
disputatious, gracias, parliaments of representative democracy and in the billowing smokestacks of the Industrial Revolution. And the way they can find what it is that makes people gel is in societies that are
mhm.
not democracies and are not industrialized. So they get obsessed with Australian Indigenous people before they're
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Australia,
yeah,
for
yeah.
example. Is that what Russell's doing, amongst others, do you think? And are there traces of that still today in Orientalism?
Yeah, which I mean, in some sense is understandable because you're sitting there looking at the society. I'm thinking sitting there, you meaning the Westerners is sitting there in their society. I mean, including some of us who live in the West, we're not from there, but sitting there thinking, okay, this is not working. This model is not working, right? Like this kind of capitalism, individualism, environmental degradation, all, I mean, what's happening in Lebanon. I mean, like the world is not working. This can't be that what we really kind of can achieve from humanity. And so then not the obvious, a natural way is to kind of go look in the places that seem least touched by these by the West, right? Now, the I don't think that's wrong. My issue with that is there's no such place, right? I mean, there might be some indigenous groups somewhere, but even those have to live within the rules of the modern order. They have to kind of, succumb to the environmental sort of realities that the other parts of the world have sort of imposed on them. And so so then I think this kind of quest for this alternative can't be in I think I think the quest has to come from time, not space, meaning like, there's no alternatives in the world today that are sort of untouched by this. But I think that's why my interest in going to the past is that you have ways in which things have been done that are different. Now, then the issue is, and Russell does some of that, he's interested in sort of the past, but then also, even when you look at the past, you can't say, oh, they lived better because they have these, I don't know, collective ways of lives or whatever. Then you're like, okay, yeah, and they also suffered under, they had no freedoms. Like it's not like the past is some panacea, but it does have these features that we would like. And so then the question is like, can we somehow bring some of those features without taking the whole past wholesale? And so I understand the appeal of this kind of move of looking in the East for this alternative, and looking in these sort of less kind of touch. I mean, also for Russell at that point, he can say this about China. I mean, obviously now China, if you go to it, and that's what people tell me when they go to Beijing is like, oh, I was expecting it. It looks so kind of like familiar, like Beijing is a very modern city. Like, you're not gonna get spirituality from being in Beijing, right? And so people are like, okay, well, so obviously you can't find that in China now, but I do think the Chinese history um, gives sort of possibilities of doing things otherwise.
And of course, he was writing in the early 20s, wasn't he? So it's really when Mao is forming the Communist Party, or the
Right.
Communist Party is being formed, it's not that big a presence. Now, for many of us, the 1980s form the period with the so-called Asian tigers, Southeast Asian tigers, and the new International Division of Labor that shows a way forward in classical development terms for economic growth based on export-oriented industrialization instead of import substitution industrialization, which had been the recipe hitherto. And
Mhm.
you start off by looking at that moment in one of your other papers, which is about the prospects of a truly cross-cultural political theory. Can there be,
Mm-mm-mm-mm-mm-mm.
given in the contemporary moment, this extraordinary spread of industrial and post-industrial capitalism? Could you talk a little bit about that and whether there can be such a thing as
Yeah,
cross-cultural political theory?
yeah. I mean, I will say in that particular paper, I was a bit critical of that possibility because I think I mean, there has been this debate. I think this is where I start from, if I remember correctly, in that paper about sort of the rise of these East Asian tigers, Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong, and sort of how they got to where they got and whether that's related to Confucianism, whether you can learn something from it and all of that. I have this kind of deflationary view about cross-culturalism, and the view is basically that the world looks more alike than it looks different. I mean, obviously there's huge differences. I'm not dismissing those. I just think that the institutional features that we live in are so similar that it would be odd to expect completely different sort of worlds operating in them. And so, I mean, again, yeah, you can still, even if you're like in the UK, you can learn something from Germany. So like, but there's still enough similarities there. So I'm just saying that the similarities between, say, European state, like the similarities between non-European and European, probably they're less, but not that much less from the similarities between the Europeans themselves or something like that. So it's not a completely different world. And so in that sense, I'm a bit skeptical of the idea of cross-cultural learning in the modern period because I think the modern world has this kind of homogenizing aspect that makes that cross-cultural sort of learning, yeah, less possible. And so, yeah. So in that sense, I mean, obviously these Asian tigers did very well, and actually, it's sort of biographically, I got interested in China because um, basically I was interested in the rise of these tigers and how to think about it in relationship to the Arab world. So the idea was to think about East Asia as a model of development for the Arab world, and I got interested in this idea. But this is really kind of more of an economic question, or a political, like sort of an economic development kind of question. And so I was fascinated by that question, and there was these debates about whether Confucianism plays a role and all of that. But I think that's an issue of sort of, state policies about, as you said, import, export, something like that. I don't know that it has anything to do with Confucianism. So it's less of a cultural thing. It's more of a policy difference. But then somehow my interest in these questions, although I felt like Confucianism didn't answer that question, I felt like it could answer other questions. So from there, I went to do my historical work.
No, nice. And getting back to the Russell piece, if I could,
Yeah, of course.
sorry to keep tethering
Yeah,
you up.
that's fine.
I mean, I can't believe it said that he and his wife had sex into their 90s. I mean, and this is
That, that I never heard of, and I'm not
pre
sure I have.
Viagra. Well, it just shows you the old guy was onto something, um, whatever it was.
I guess I should change my views of him now.
Well, remember, I mean, he and Sartre called for a boycott of the 1968 Olympics
Mm,
because of the murder by the state of hundreds, maybe thousands of protesters in Tlatelolco, here in Mexico. He had that big commission into the Vietnam War that he ran in the 60s. But yeah, maybe China in the 20s wasn't his greatest moment. Putting
Yeah.
that aside, though, there's a very interesting moment in that essay when you touch on one of the things that often raises the hackles of people who are engaged in intercultural or cross-cultural theorization, which is you basically endorse the idea, I think I'm right in saying,
Mhm.
of some universals,
Yeah.
normative ideals, freedom and equality as universal and thus universally applicable. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that. And I should say, I'm 100% with you on this, not least because I don't know of any systems of thought that don't claim universalism. That's what they are, like
Yeah.
religions.
Yeah. So I am less worried about, yeah, some aspects of universalism than others. I mean, the issue obviously is that these universal ideas have been imposed through these very violent imperial endeavors and the through colonial projects in much of the sort of the global south, right? So they clearly did not live up to their claim of being universal by a mere dint of the power of the idea. They came with the power of, arms and exploitation. Um, but I still think that, yes, as you said, there's, Confucianism also claims to be universal. I mean, they're not saying this ideas are good for us and not good for other people. Like, an idea is good when it's good for people. Now, the other aspect that is relevant here and relates to the point I was saying earlier, that is that this kind of is this idea that I described as it's deflationary, which is this kind of the idea of the modern condition being so similar around the world. And so it's a little odd to, to once these various societies have adopted the modern state system, for them to come up with any other ideas to deal with it than something like freedom and equality. It is the right idea to deal with this kind of structure, right? And the ideas don't sort of operate out of context. They respond to specific institutional features. So it is not surprising that when you have protests around the world, whether in China, in Hong Kong, or in Tunisia, or in India, whatever, that you would have people make demands of freedom of and equality. Like, we can't take it away from them. And so then, so I'm less concerned about talking about these ideas because I think these are ideals that people want, right? But so, and they want them because they are all subject to state power, and the only way to respond to state power is by advocating for rights, for individual freedoms, for some sense of equality of the citizens before the law, and all of that. That's the only tool that's appropriate to fight that kind of institutional structure. So yes, so I do start from there. And now, yeah, I mean, then you can think about, what these histories of these ideas have done in the world through these colonial endeavors, also how these various traditions have thought about these ideals, but I'm not, and these are all relevant to the question, but I think the mere fact of the appeal of these ideas around the globe can't be denied.
Onto Confucianism in particular, if we could, there's another really interesting article of yours about gender and
Hmm.
Confucianism, specifically the role of women,
Hmm.
some of the philosophical writings. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks for asking. It's part of my new project, so I'm excited to talk about it. But so the one thing that people will say about Confucianism is it's a patriarchal philosophy, and in some sense it is, and in some sense all philosophy is of that period, of the ancient period. I mean, honestly, all philosophies before the middle of the 20th century were probably patriarchal, and even then they are still are. So I'm not going to suddenly say that it's not. I was interested though in trying to think of what it means for it to be patriarchal, meaning, okay, let's say that it's patriarchal. What more can we say about the role that women have? And one obvious thing you don't have in the Confucian texts is you don't have women rulers. I mean, there were various women empresses in Chinese history, but in terms of the texts themselves, how they present the ideal of rulers or the ideas of officials, these were not female ideals. And so in some sense, the women were absent in a way, except the one place where they were present, when this is the idea that intrigues me, was whenever there were discussions of specific rituals, and particular rituals having to do with death and mourning, and which are very central to the Confucians. Women were very central to these rituals, and they weren't there to play a supporting role for the men. They weren't just there to kind of, assist, or they weren't just there in these rooms and the inside waiting for the men to be done. They were part of the ritual. They were taken care of. They were part of the ceremonies of sacrifice to ancestors, like these drinks exchange that they have, these kind of even preparing the various kind of offerings and the drinks that were involved in ceremonies, both of mourning and also of these kind of ancestor. They usually call them ancestor worship, and they're related to the mourning aspect. Um, so I was interested in the place of women that they had in those, and my contention there is that, you know, in a sense, yes, the women are not being envisioned as rulers and officials and ministers and all of that. In another sense, though, they play a very crucial roles in these rituals that for the Confucians are very key to thinking about the continuation of society. Because for them, what's kind of grounding the society is this kind of respect we show to the people before us, whether it's ancestors or people who just died, because these are all sort of a continuation of each other, right? And so the fact that these women were visibly, publicly present in these rituals, were not segregated from men from them, were taking this part, suggests to me that they clearly saw women to be central to these kind of foundational aspects, foundational sort of institutions, if you can call them that, to the society. And then you add to that this idea of the mother role, and that again we think about when we think about Confucians, and one thing that people will think about is filial piety, or the respect that children owe their parents. Very kind of everyone knows that, but I think our mind immediately goes to, well, they probably mean fathers, because it's a patriarchal society and like it's Confucians, whatever. But in fact, at least in the early texts, they say fumu, which means father and mother. It's always father and mother. It's not, this is not a patriarchal institution. This is the respect is owed to both. Um, I mean, there are ways in which, when you get to mourning period, if the mother is alive but not the father, the mourning, sort of the mourning for the father is more than the mourning for the mother. So there are differences. I'm not denying them, but I think the centrality is to respect to parents, not to fathers as such. And again, this is a way in which it shows that just saying patriarchal doesn't quite get you there, that there's the place in which these women are there, they are envisioned as playing a role. And I think that's an important corrective to what we might otherwise assume to be true of Confucian thought.
And there's a more recent piece yet, which relates to things we've already discussed, where you do this comparison of different non-Western empires
Yeah.
and the models that they might provide for thinking about a different form of polity, let's say,
Mm.
or a different set of political arrangements. And one of the things you highlight in that essay is non-territorial
Yeah.
imperialism.
Mm.
Could you chat a wee bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, this is related to the Ottoman point earlier, because the Ottomans is the one example I talked about. Um, I mean, we think that it's necessary. We think, meaning we moderns, think that it's necessary to think of ideas of identity related to territory, that it should matter where you're born. I mean, lots of countries will give you, I mean, there's a whole debate now in the US about whether you should have birthright citizenship based on where you're born. But even countries that don't allow it, that do make a distinction. Like it matters the actual territory where you're born. That seems to play a big role in sort of defining your identity in the future. Um, and then again, we have borders, and borders, what are they? Just demarcating territory. And then rules apply within borders are very almost like basically the rules don't apply. Like you cross a line and then suddenly you're a completely different world that rules, different rules apply to you or no rules apply or whatever. But that is not a necessary idea. We don't have to do things this way. And these imperial examples were examples of the possibility that you could have things being didn't have to have these like complete strong lines. I mean, the one way in which people talk about the Chinese example is that it's less like borders, it's more what you might call a frontier or something, because it might move all the time, and the people inside can become outside. It keeps moving. They keep so there's not this idea that, I put my foot on this piece of land. I am subject to the laws of this country. I cross one, and it's completely different. I'm out of the law, or uh, because again, this has thinking about these things in these kind of territorial bordered ways has implications for thinking about inclusion and exclusion, meaning there's always an excluded, it's like built into the system. Whereas if you think of a gradation kind of system or overlapping jurisdictions of people can be in more than in one place, perhaps what matters is not so much the territory, but what matters is the practices or the institutions. That would change our idea of, how do we kind of include people, whether it's possible to, not necessarily kind of always be defined by some other that lives, beyond the borders of our country and that's kind of defined as being, a stranger to us. And so these were examples kind of thinking about, yeah, this fluidity of these borders, the possibility of laws not being uniform across them, and all of that that I was interested in.
I can't help thinking now of the European Union
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
because it is some sort of attempt in the
Sure.
recent past to
Yeah.
transcend these borders, and doing so in the full knowledge of Europe as the cradle of global conflict. I don't think there's any other way of understanding
Yeah. Yeah.
that, but starting with its own internal conflicts, as it were, and then
Yeah.
spreading around the
Yeah.
globe in the form of imperialism, but most spectacularly, perhaps, in the form of the two world wars. Does that give you hope, or is that just one more sovereign state model?
No, I actually think that it was, I mean, I remember thinking when the UK, with Brexit, that it was sad because they were folding back into this older model of the only way you can have self-determination is within, this bounded community that is and then especially the leftist arguments for it, I found a bit, like that we were kind of insistent on this idea that the only way you can be kind of, again, you can have self-determination is through this model of sovereignty that's kind of bounded in this way, and that by definition excluded people and then allow people to come in from different countries. I think it's a hopeful model. I'm not an expert on it. I know there's a lot of debates about the EU. It does also kind of, it does have this aspect of kind of, it plays into the greatness of Europe and the connections between these countries, and sort of, you can see from the difficulties some countries have to get in over others, that this kind of like this Western European kind of ideas of their, that they want to come together because they're the great nations and maybe we'll bring some other people in. So there's a bit of that, but at least institutionally, it's an attempt to think a model that was not just based on these, the idea of just a state as a bounded state. And in that respect, um, I think that's interesting. And in fact, there is a lot of precedent in East Asia for kind of trying to think about relations across states that were not, that you had, I mean, yeah, again, there's controversy about whether the tribute system in East Asia was, how dominating it was. And in the same way that you have debates in the EU about how equal the system is and all of that. Um, but at least to my mind, it shows the possibility, this is the one example we have now of someone trying to do something like this, right? And I think that's an interesting
It's
example.
something. I mean, of course, it relies on Germany and France
And they keep fighting. Yeah, yeah,
being liberally minded.
yeah, yeah,
Fascists take over those countries, which may
right. But
happen.
yeah, yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, and I think that's in some sense a Brexit argument that like, you get better defense if you kind of close off, but again, at the price of what? I mean,
Well, I think part of, I mean, obviously, this is not the rabbit hole we want to go down, but
yeah,
one of the faults with the Remain campaign, I thought, I mean, I was in Colombia, so I was a long way away, but
yeah,
nevertheless, was this emphasis on economic disaster instead of peace. What they should
Yeah.
have said is, we are the cradle of world destruction,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. We need to get
less
over.
so in the last 70 years, and this is why.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think that's um yeah, the linkage. And interestingly, actually, this goes back to empire, that in some sense, I know that some of the kind of architects of the European Union, some of the early thinkers about this were kind of thinking when they thought about empire, they also thought of this, when they thought about this universal kind of, all of the peoples of the world coming together, right? Again, this also had these dimensions of then yes, you go bring them together through colonial, colonizing them. So I'm not, you know, uh, I'm not saying this is all great, but there is a sense in which there's this, in some sense, empires at some point was not understood in the way we understand it today, which is just a domination project. On its more principled version, it was understood of this possibility of kind of bringing more and more people together under these more fluid institutional structures that allowed for different jurisdictions and different overlapping jurisdictions, all of that. And the EU was meant to be an example of that.
Now, going back to Lebanon for a moment, if we
Yeah,
could,
of course.
um, the mission civilisatrice is one of the things
Hmm.
that the Lebanese have grown up with.
Mm.
France, a minor player, if anything, now. But what do you see as some of the echoes of that imperial experience in some of the Arab world? Because there's so much focus on the British and the Americans, and not so much perhaps on the French nowadays.
By echoes, you mean like how what the Lebanese have learned from it, or
Learned from it, taken from it, rejected of it. Because after all, a lot of, I mean, I'm thinking in particular of your bailiwick of political theory. There's a
yeah,
French political theory. It's pretty important. It's pretty substantial. It's pretty interesting. But I don't know
yeah,
how that was relevant to the mission civilisatrice.
yeah. I mean, the debate, at least in the Arab world, is the extent to which the sectarian differences were themselves an idea that the colonials brought about. Um, and I'm not a historian of that period to kind of settle that question. I mean, clearly they clearly enforced them if they did not create them. And so that's something that, but that's less about their philosophy. That's just that's I don't even know that's a mission civilisatrice. It's just a divide and conquer kind of policy, right? It's easier to rule this way. So in that sense, that's a legacy that these countries are still fighting with, sort of what to do with these sectarian differences and how much are they, indigenous and how much are they have been imposed on us. But even if they've been imposed, it's been quite a while, so they become, indigenized, if you may. So there's that. I mean, there's a lot of I'm just yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like French cultural influence, I was going to say, but I don't know that there's any kind of, I can't think of any kind of more deeper philosophical. I mean, there is this idea of like, at some point you had it ended up changing, but initially in the Lebanese constitution, the president had a lot of power, and that was kind of drawn from the French Republican model of the executive being in the hands of the president, but that ended up being changed in Lebanon after the Taif Agreement in 1991. So that no longer was the case. So that influence, I think, sort of has uh, reduced with time.
Prof, I have one more question for you, if I may.
First, yeah,
When you've answered it, I'd like to give you the opportunity to add anything you wish, which
sure.
can take the form of looking at some terrain we've already covered, where there's something more you want to
Mhm.
share, or something entirely new that we've not touched on. Does that sound okay as a way of bringing?
Sounds great.
So my final question is to ask if you would share with us a little bit more about the new book. That
Yes,
sounds really fascinating.
that sounds perfect. Um, so the new book is motivated by a simple idea that I think has not been given enough attention, which is that if you read ancient Chinese texts, you find no slaves, no mention of anything akin to slavery. Whereas, as we know, that category is central to the Greek texts, and that's how we learn them. And the question that comes after that is then scholars who've written about Greece and, including more recently, there's a lot of discussion about how much freedom was brought about because precisely of the experience of slavery. And so these things come together that the Greeks invented freedom because of slavery. Moses Finley is the first one to come up with the idea, but then you have a lot of kind of more contemporary scholars coming up with that. So I was sort of intrigued by this absence, but also intrigued about its implications because, yeah, you might say, um, I mean, you might say, okay, yeah, there's no slavery and there's no freedom, and we know there's no freedom in China. There's nothing, but it would be odd if the absence of slavery would count against China somehow, right? That that it should count, that like there's something going on there in the fact that they didn't have a category like this,
What
and so
is
then
wrong with you? You don't have William Wilberforce and you don't have
yeah,
Abraham Lincoln. What is
and so
wrong with you?
yeah, exactly. How else would you come up with freedom? You should have come up with this so you can have freedom. So I'm like, there's something wrong with like insisting on this duality when in fact it should be, it should count again in their favor that they didn't come up with something like this, even if it meant that they didn't come up with this other idea we call freedom. And then there's a question there about what we mean by freedom when we contrast it with slavery in this way. I'm not going to get into that. But the point is, I was interested then in the question of like how the early Chinese texts considered people that we might think of as low status. So then I look at sort of workers, artisans, farmers. I look at women. We talked about women. I look at foreigners, people who would, in the translations, often they'll be called, the English is barbarian, but they don't have to necessarily see them this way. Criminals, convicts. So all of these people that we might expect to be kind of servants, people who we'd expect to be kind of at the margins of society or lower, and the book is trying to think about how they're depicted, how they're portrayed, what they're thought of. And my main argument is that the Confucian conception of political community is quite inclusive. So what you get when you don't have slavery, you still have hierarchy, but it's a hierarchy based on merit, and it allows for the possibility of people moving up in that structure, and it's always inclusive. And so the idea is that, yeah, in the Greek model is a sort of technically a model of equality, if you think of at least about Athens, but at the cost of exclusion, because then you have all these slaves who are, sort of at least like, half of the population. In China, the model might be hierarchical, and it is hierarchical, but it's inclusive, right? And sort of me going through these various peoples who, do appear to be lower in the hierarchies and all of that is trying to kind of, again, trying to think about how they're viewed. There's no way in which they're viewed as being kind of, they're not denigrated, they're not being viewed as impure. There's no concern about relating to them. There's no concern about their social mobility. I mean, there is a recognition that some people might end up not having the life that other people have. So it's not I'm not talking about some idyllic system where everyone kind of moves up. But there's not this need to categorize certain people as beyond the pale somehow. And I find that fascinating. And I think it allows this conception to be yeah, to be just more inclusive, because there's never this need to define yourself against the other. Again, the idea is like, oh well, the free discovered that they were free because they were not slaves, right? But then that already builds in that you get this great thing by constantly thinking about who's the person who's low in that way and to be different from it. That kind of that logic is kind of built into that system. Whereas if you look at these Confucian ancient texts, there's no logic of like defining myself in contradiction to someone else. In fact, it's in relation to. So, there are people lower or higher than me. The question is like why they're low or high, what puts them there. But that the question is like, I am the opposite of that other person, right? That logic of exclusion is not built into it. And I find that fascinating. And so the book is trying to kind of elicit that. by again thinking through how these categories of people that I mentioned are portrayed, and trying to show that yeah, like sometimes we think that all good things come together, so you're gonna have, the Greeks are this great model of like, equality and freedom and all of that. But I'm trying to say, look, this comes at this great price of exclusion. For the Chinese case, we've only looked at hierarchy and thought it was bad, but look what other things it allowed, or that came with it at least. And its inclusion is the idea of not othering, is the idea that anyone can be part of it. And I'm not saying one of these sets is better than the other set. I'm trying to say that, look, in these sets, you have these multiple dimensions that we just kind of look at the positive ones in the Greek world and the negative ones in the Chinese world. And I'm trying to say these are interconnected ideas that we should kind of look at all of it to understand the difference between these two kind of models of government.
Wow, can't wait, can't wait, can't wait. And finally, anything you'd like to add?
No, I mean, I actually wanted to say that it's just lovely to have this discussion, and I hope because you kept saying about how some of the you don't get these books in Mexico, and I know this is a problem. I mean, I know in Lebanon too. So I it would be what I was gonna say is like it's nice to be. I mean, I hope that this is kind of more work from the global south, but also more kind of connectedness and sort of infrastructure, making it possible for people from from these various parts of the world to be part of the same conversation that, we're having. And the first thing I'm going to do when my book is out is to send you a copy.
Well, thank you so, so much. It's been
Yeah,
wonderful learning from you. I
yeah,
appreciate
thank you.
it.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.